Okay, let's unpack this. We're taking a deep dive today into an event that, well, some of the sources we've got describe it as possibly the deadliest mass murder of Native Americans by the U.S. military.
And maybe even the largest single episode of genocide in U.S. history. It's a profoundly difficult piece of American history, no question.
We're focusing on the Bear River Massacre, happened January 29th, 1863, up in what's now southeastern Idaho.
Right. And to help us understand it, we've got, quite a range of materials, historical analyses, sure, but also excerpts from official reports, things written at the time.
And crucially, perspectives and accounts directly from the Northwestern Shoshone Nation themselves. That's key here.
Absolutely. So our goal today isn't just to recount facts. We want to really dig into these sources, understand the context, what led up to it, the events of that day, the devastating consequences, both immediate and long-term.
And really importantly, how the story itself has been told over time, how that narrative has changed, especially with the Shoshone people working to reclaim their history.
Exactly. It's essential for a fuller picture of the American West and, frankly, American history overall.
We know this is heavy stuff. It's a difficult history, but we'll walk through what the sources tell us, aiming for clarity. So let's get into it.
Okay, so to understand the massacre, you really have to understand the road that led there. It wasn't just out of the blue.
Right. Context is everything.
It starts in Cache Valley. Suabiogoi, the Shoshone call it Willow Valley. This was their ancestral home, absolutely vital for their whole way of life. Migratory subsistence, gathering, fishing, hunting, everything.
The foundation of their culture and survival, and the sources are really clear. Things changed incredibly fast, starting around 1860.
That speed is one of the first things that jumps out. Mormon settlers start arriving in spring 1860. By the winter of 63, so less than 3 years.
Less than 3 years. Wow.
The sources say they had appropriated pretty much all the usable land and water. Think about that. Your whole food source, your environment, just gone almost overnight.
And that loss, that massive immediate loss of resources, the hunting grounds, the fishing spots, it created a direct link to the conflict, didn't it?
Absolutely direct. Facing starvation, the Shoshones were basically forced, according to these accounts, to start taking goods, livestock, from settlers just to survive.
Which the settlers called depredations, criminal acts.
Right. But from the Shoshone perspective, presented in some of these sources, these were desperate measures. Their traditional means of survival had been destroyed. It's a total clash of perspectives from the very beginning.
And this is happening against a backdrop of broader U.S. policy, right?
Exactly. After the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, this land becomes U.S. public domain. Technically, the federal government is supposed to manage native land rights, but settlers often just ignored existing claims.
And then the Homestead Act in '62 just made it worse.
Absolutely. It offered land to settlers with zero regard for who was already living there, for Native American occupation or rights. Plus, federal policy itself was pushing hard by the mid-1860s to extinguish all Indian land claims, get tribes onto reservations, usually through treaties.
So you've got this local powder keg stolen land, desperation bumping up against aggressive national expansion policies.
And it inevitably led to this escalating cycle of violence. The sources detail specific incidents. Young Shoshone men start retaliating more often.
Like the hanging of Pughweenie.
Yes, a young Shoshone hanged for alleged horse theft, even though a settler apparently testified for him. That act, the sources say, sparked Shoshone retaliation, leading to settler deaths like the Merrill family.
And attacks on immigrant trains were happening, too.
Right, near Fort Hall in '59, the Utter Party in '60. These were often attributed to Shoshone and Bannock groups, and it just fueled settler demands for the military to step in.
Which brings us to Colonel Patrick Edward Connor.
Yes, and the sources paint him as having a reputation already, known for being, let's say, uncompromising, even aggressive towards Native Americans from his actions elsewhere, like along the Humboldt River.
And Utah officials specifically called on him and his troops from Camp Douglas.
They did. They asked him to come punish the Northwestern Band because of the settler complaints.
Okay, but this next point from the sources seems absolutely crucial. Connor's intent.
It's chilling. Before the expedition even left, Connor stated explicitly that he intended to take no prisoners.
Take no prisoners. So this wasn't about arrests, about bringing chiefs like Bear Hunter or Sagwitch in for questioning?
No. That statement signals a premeditated punitive goal. It suggests something much more brutal than a standard military engagement was planned from the outset.
And nationally, the Civil War is raging back east. Does that play a role?
The sources suggest it does. National attention is focused eastward. Events out west like this could be sort of overlooked, receive less scrutiny.
Less oversight.
Exactly. And another small but potentially significant factor mentioned is the poorly defined boundary between Washington and Utah territories, right in that area. It meant government centers were far away, maybe hindering any chance for peaceful resolution or clear authority.
So putting it all together, the sources tell us this wasn't some random fight. It was this tragic convergence of factors. Settlers taking over land incredibly fast, U.S. policy pushing Indians out, a cycle of violence spinning out of control, and a military commander seemingly intent on punishment, not justice.
That sets the stage for January 29, 1863, and just getting there was an ordeal for Connor's troops.
Right, the sources describe this brutal winter march, 140 miles from Camp Douglas.
Intense cold. Many soldiers got severe frostbite. Some were apparently crippled for life just from the journey.
That hardship must have affected their mindset too, you'd think. So they arrive, and the Shoshone camp is where?
Strategically located, at the confluence of Beaver Creek and the Bear River, down in a deep ravine offering natural defenses.
And the Shoshone were ready for trouble.
As ready as they could be. Sources mentioned they'd made firing steps in the banks, used willow branches for cover. Connor estimated maybe 300 warriors, well-armed.
But Shoshone accounts differ.
Significantly. They say they had very few guns, very little ammunition, mostly bows and arrows. That difference in perspective on their armament is important.
Okay, so the attack starts early morning, around 6 a.m. How did it unfold initially?
The soldiers launched a frontal assault first. Engaged the Shoshone, who apparently fought back fiercely. Some accounts even say they came out defiantly, but that initial attack failed.
Failed. So the Shoshone defenses held at first.
They did. In fact, most of the U.S. casualties, and they took significant losses early on, happened in that first half hour or so.
Okay, so Connor realizes the direct approach isn't working. What then?
He adapts tactically. He orders Major McGarry to take a detachment and flank the Shoshone position, basically get around to their left side where the ravine wall was lower, closer to the mountainside.
And they had trouble crossing the river.
The icy river, yeah. They actually had to ferry some infantry across to help support that flanking movement.
And that flanking move was the turning point.
Absolutely critical. Once the troops got up onto the banks, flanking the ravine...
They could fire down into it.
Exactly. It was called enfilading fire, shooting down the length of the ravine from both sides. It essentially trapped the Shoshone in the bottom with no cover from above.
And from that point, the descriptions get brutal.
They do. The sources described relentless, indiscriminate firing on men, women, children. There are horrific eyewitness accounts from settlers mentioned, describing soldiers raping women, using axes on the wounded, including children.
Even Connor's own report acknowledged it.
Yes, his report chillingly states there was no quarters that day. No mercy shown.
The fighting lasted about 4 hours.
Uh-oh.
Until mid-morning.
Roughly. Yeah, till about 10 a.m. Those who tried to flee north ran into soldiers stationed there and were shot. Those who tried to swim the freezing Bear River to escape were also shot in the water.
So the Shoshone had defenses. They fought back hard at first.
But ultimately, the sheer number of U.S. soldiers, Connor's successful flanking tactic, and probably the devastating effects of the extreme cold on everyone involved, it made resistance futile.
And the acts described the killing of non-combatants, the rape, the killing of wounded. It goes way beyond a typical battle.
Far beyond. The analysis in our sources points to these acts as strong evidence supporting the description of the event as having a genocidal nature.
Looking at the immediate aftermath, the numbers are just devastating. What did the sources say about Shoshone casualties?
There's a range, which itself is telling. Connor officially reported counting 224 bodies. Other historical estimates go from 250 up to 400.
But there's one account that's even higher.
Yes, a Mormon pioneer, Hans Jasperson, later claimed he counted 493 dead Shoshone. Whatever the exact number, all accounts agree on one horrific fact.
That the vast majority killed were women and children.
The vast majority. It wasn't primarily warriors who died, it was families, which just underscores the indiscriminate nature of the killing.
And you contrast that with the U.S. casualties. What were those numbers again?
Around 21 to 23 soldiers killed, maybe 46 to 49 wounded, and about 75 with severe frostbite.
The difference is staggering. It just doesn't sound like a battle report.
No, it doesn't. And beyond the deaths, there was total destruction. Soldiers burned over 70 Shoshone lodges, destroyed their food supplies.
Which they desperately needed. Connor took supplies too, right?
Yes, about 1,000 bushels of wheat and flour, which he claimed Mormons had supplied to the Shoshone, plus around 175 of their horses. Vital resources gone.
And the treatment of the dead? And the survivors
Yeah.
really highlights the dehumanization.
It's stark. The U.S. soldiers killed were carefully transported back to Camp Douglas for proper burial. The Shoshone bodies left on the field.
Just left there.
Accounts say for the wolves and crows, leaving bodies exposed like that. It speaks volumes about how the victims were viewed. And the roughly 160 captured women and children were also just left there in the freezing cold with only a tiny amount of wheat.
It's hard to comprehend. And then there are the survivor stories.
Which bring the trauma down to such a personal, devastating level. Chief Sagwitch survived, wounded, but most of his family was killed.
Like the story of Anzi Chi.
Yes, a young mother, hiding with others, forced to drown her own crying infant to prevent them all from being discovered. An impossible, horrific choice.
And Sagwitch's own children.
His 2-year-old son, Bishop, was wounded, survived, but was later traded, tragically, to a Mormon family for food. Another son, Yeager, survived by playing dead among the bodies.
And his infant daughter.
Sagwitch found her alive next to his dead wife and other children. In desperation, hoping someone might find her, he put her in a cradle board and hung it high in a tree. These stories, they convey the trauma far beyond what numbers can.
Looking at the longer term, what was the immediate impact on the land, on Cache Valley?
The sources are blunt. White settlers moved unopposed into traditional northwestern Shoshone lands. The massacre directly achieved the goal of clearing the land for settlement. Irreversible loss for the Shoshone.
And this event, this violence, it fit into that broader U.S. policy push we talked about earlier.
Absolutely. It acted as a brutal enforcement tool for that policy of extinguishing Indian land claims and forcing tribes onto reservations, which really ramped up from the late 1860s into the 1880s. Here, the violence just sped that process up dramatically.
So facing starvation, their land gone, how did the surviving Shoshone adapt?
They were forced into really drastic strategies. Many, including Chief Sagwitch's band, actually converted to Mormonism in 1875. They settled on church farms, like the one at Washakie. It was a way to survive, find some stability.
Even after converting, there was pressure to move them.
Yes, federal officials kept trying to push them onto the Fort Hall reservation. Some did end up there, but others resisted, found other ways, like settling the Mallet Indian farm, even using the Homestead Act themselves to try and secure some land. The struggle just continued for decades.
But amidst all this loss and struggle, the sources also emphasize the resilience of the northwestern Shoshone Nation.
Incredible resilience, yes. A huge step was finally achieving federal recognition as an independent tribe in 1987.
And that raises the question, how do you heal from something like this? What steps have they taken?
Well, the sources highlight some really powerful acts of reclamation. A landmark moment was in 2018 when the Northwestern Band managed to acquire a significant portion of the massacre site itself, around 350 to 650 acres of their ancestral land.
Duning the land where it happened.
Exactly. Yeah. They've designated it as sacred burial ground. There are plans for a monument. It's about reclaiming that space, honoring their ancestors.
And there was also the repatriation of remains.
Yes, in 2013, the Smithsonian returned the remains of 2 individuals, a teenage man and a young woman killed in the massacre. After more than 150 years, the Shoshone could finally give them a proper, traditional burial on their own terms.
These feel like incredibly important acts of self-determination, taking back control of their history, their land, their ancestors.
It really is. It shows them actively shaping their own narrative, moving beyond just being victims to asserting agency over their past and future. It's about resilience.
And that work continues today, right? At the site itself.
Very much so. They're deeply involved in cultural preservation and environmental stewardship there. Ecological restoration is a huge focus.
What does that involve?
Guided by tribal elders and scientists, they're planting thousands of native trees, shrubs, restoring the creeks that run through the site. It's extensive work.
And they plan to build an interpretive center.
Yes, a cultural interpretive center. The goal is education, preserving traditions, but also emphasizing indigenous views on the human-land connection. It's about sharing their perspective.
And that ecological work connects to broader environmental goals, too.
It does. Restoring the creeks helps return water to the Bear River, which is a major tributary for the Great Salt Lake. So they see healing the site as connected to healing the larger ecosystem. It's this really holistic view of healing history, people, and the environment together.
Which brings us to how this story has been told or not told over the years, the historiography.
Right, because for almost a century, this event was largely ignored nationally. The Civil War overshadowed it, and the early accounts were incredibly one-sided.
Relying only on military reports, settler accounts.
Almost exclusively. Shoshone oral histories, their side of the story, were completely left out for decades.
And early attempts to commemorate it actually reinforced a biased view.
Definitely. Look at the 1941 mural in the Preston Post Office. It's titled The Battle of Bear River.
Battle, not massacre.
Exactly. And it shows inaccuracies Shoshone nearly naked in the dead of winter, depicted mostly as warriors. But we know women and children were the majority of the dead, and they're almost invisible in the painting.
And monuments put up later continued this narrative.
Yes, monuments from 1932 and 1953 also called it a battle, claimed it was provoked by hostile attacks, and really downplayed the deaths of women and children. One even used the phrase 90 combatant women and children.
Combatant women and children, that's quite a framing.
It's an attempt to justify their deaths, to sanitize the event. These early versions were basically historical erasure, reinforcing the savage Indian trope and letting society avoid the truth. Even early academic work sometimes used battle and relied on those biased reports.
So when did things start to shift?
A really pivotal moment was 1985, with Brigham Manson's book, The Shoshone Frontier and the Bear River Massacre. It was one of the first major academic studies to call it a massacre unequivocally and label it a national catastrophe.
What made Matson's work different?
He incorporated Shoshone perspectives, their oral histories, and he highlighted the huge number of women and children killed, facts that had been ignored or minimized for so long. His later biography of Connor also dug into Connor's aggressive reputation and that crucial no prisoners statement.
But Matson's work built on something else, didn't it? The sources emphasized the Shoshone role.
Absolutely. The most critical factor in changing the narrative, the sources make clear, has been the persistent advocacy of the Shoshone people themselves, particularly May-Timbimbu Perry.
Chief Sagwitch's granddaughter.
Yes, she was instrumental. She worked with Manson, bringing those vital oral histories to a wider audience, and she fought tirelessly for the name change, for official recognition that this was a massacre, not a battle.
And that pressure worked.
It did. The National Park Service officially adopted the term massacre in 1990, largely due to her advocacy. It shows the power of language, how choosing the right word acknowledges the reality of what happened.
And her grandson, Darren Perry, continues that work today.
He does. He's considered the leading living scholar on the massacre now. His 2019 book, The Bear River Massacre, A Shoshone History, is the first full account from a Shoshone perspective.
What's his focus?
He continues to challenge myths. He argues the death toll was at least 400, based on family counts. He clarifies things like the fortifications were just normal winter windbreaks. He led the charge to update the historical marker at the site in 2021, making sure it reflects the horror and the estimated deaths accurately. And he's leading the Cultural Center project. It's about ensuring the Shoshone voice is central.
So you can really trace this shift in official recognition over the last few decades.
Definitely. National Historic Landmark status in 1990, the land acquisition in 2018, the repatriation of remains in 2013. New signs at the site, even international attention like that Irish documentary on Connor. It all shows the narrative moving away from silence and misrepresentation towards truth, driven by the descendants.
It really underscores that struggle for narrative control and how vital Indigenous voices are in correcting history.
It's absolutely essential. This whole story of how the story was told is about reclaiming truth from erasure.
So wrapping up this deep dive, the sources really lay bare the Bear River Massacre as this just profound tragedy fueled by settler expansion, government policy, military aggression, a stated intent for punishment.
We've seen the horrific human cost
Yeah.
and how important that distinction between battle and massacre really is for understanding what happened.
And a huge takeaway has to be the resilience and the crucial advocacy of the Northwestern Shoshone Nation. Their work today reclaiming land, culture, stewarding the environment, it's such a powerful statement of healing and self-determination.
Absolutely. Facing these hard truths like the Bear River Massacre, it's not easy. It shows us a really ugly side of the past.
But the sources argue it's necessary. Necessary for real understanding and for building a more just future. Hopefully this deep dive helps you, the listener, move past a simplified version and grasp the complexity, the brutality, and the lasting human impact.
It maybe leave you with this thought. Reflecting on the Northwestern Shoshones' approach today, linking the healing of historical trauma directly to caring for the land itself. What does that connection tell you about how history, justice, and the environment might be intertwined? How can we maybe apply that kind of understanding as we move forward?